March 11, 2006. In the early morning hours, prison guards found Europe's most wanted war criminal dead in his cell. No suicide note, no signs of violence, no witnesses. But in his blood, they discovered a drug that wasn't supposed to be there. Slobodan Milošević had spent 5 years evading justice at the world's most secure tribunal. He'd demanded treatment in Russia, been denied, and repeatedly warned he was dying. Then suddenly, he was. Natural death or the ultimate escape? The autopsy raised more questions than it answered, leaving behind a mystery that haunts international justice to this day. This is the story of how the butcher of the Balkans may have cheated his final judgment, and why the truth about his last hours might be more disturbing than the crimes that put him there. When Josip Broz Tito died in 1980, Yugoslavia became a powder keg waiting for someone ruthless enough to light the fuse. That someone was a 39-year-old banker named Slobodan Milošević. While other communist leaders clung to fading socialist rhetoric, Milošević discovered something more powerful. Nationalism wasn't just a political tool, it was the ultimate weapon. In 1987, he traveled to Kosovo, Poland, and delivered 7 words that changed Balkan history. No one should dare to beat you again. Those words ignited a Serbian nationalist movement that would consume Yugoslavia in flames. Milošević had found his formula: identify ancient grievances, amplify them through state media, and present himself as the only leader strong enough to settle historical scores. Within months, he controlled the Serbian Communist Party. Within years, he controlled Serbia itself. But Serbia wasn't enough. When Slovenia and Croatia declared independence in 1991, Milošević saw opportunity where others saw crisis. He unleashed paramilitary groups with names like White Eagles and Serbian Volunteer Guard to carve out his vision of Greater Serbia, keeping his own hands seemingly clean while the killing began. The man who promised to protect Serbs had become the architect of Europe's bloodiest conflict since World War II. But the methods he used to build his empire would eventually become the evidence that destroyed him. By 1992, Milošević's proxies were implementing a strategy that would introduce a new term to international law: ethnic cleansing. The goal was brutal in its simplicity: remove non-Serb populations through systematic terror and mass murder. In Bosnia, his forces established concentration camps where civilians were tortured and executed. Towns with centuries of multi-ethnic coexistence were cleansed in days. Their mosques dynamited, their populations murdered or driven into exile. Sarajevo became a shooting gallery. For 1,425 days, Serbian artillery rained shells on hospitals, schools, and marketplaces, while snipers turned crossing the street into a death sentence. Then came Srebrenica. In July 1995, Serbian forces systematically executed over 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys in Europe's worst atrocity since the Holocaust. General Ratko Mladić commanded the operation, but international investigators later proved Milošević coordinated the logistics. But even genocide wasn't enough. In 1998, he turned to Kosovo, sparking a campaign that finally triggered international intervention. NATO's 78-day bombing campaign brought the war directly to Belgrade, and for the first time, Milošević faced real consequences. Serbian cities burned, the economy collapsed, street protests challenged his authority. The man who built his career on nationalism was destroying Serbia to save his own skin. But his downfall would create an even bigger problem: what to do with a war criminal who knew where all the bodies were buried. The end began on October 5, 2000, when hundreds of thousands of Serbs surrounded the parliament building in Belgrade, demanding Milošević accept his defeat in presidential elections he had tried to steal. The regime that had seemed unshakable for over a decade crumbled in a single day. Police and military units refused orders to fire on protesters. State television stations were stormed and occupied. By evening, Milošević was barricaded in his residence, abandoned by the security forces that had once executed his every command. But removing Milošević from power proved easier than deciding what to do with him. The new Serbian government faced intense international pressure to extradite him to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, but doing so risked triggering a nationalist backlash that could destabilize the fragile democracy. The standoff lasted until March 31, 2001, when Serbian police finally arrested Milošević at his Belgrade villa after a tense 26-hour siege. Even in defeat, he remained defiant, barricading himself inside and threatening desperate measures rather than surrender. The extradition to The Hague came 3 months later, on the last possible day before international aid to Serbia would have been suspended. Milošević was loaded onto a British Royal Air Force plane and flown to the Netherlands to face justice for crimes that had torn Europe apart. His arrival at the tribunal marked a historic moment, the first time a former head of state had been charged with genocide by an international court. The indictment contained 66 separate counts, covering atrocities in Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo, spanning nearly a decade of warfare. When Milošević appeared in court for his initial hearing on July 2001, he refused to enter a plea or recognize the tribunal's legitimacy. "This is a false tribunal," he declared, "and the indictment is a false indictment." Rather than hiring lawyers, he chose to represent himself, turning every hearing into a political theater. The trial began on February 12, 2002, with prosecutors presenting evidence of systematic atrocities spanning 3 wars. Witnesses testified about mass executions, rape camps, and forced deportations. Video evidence showed Serbian forces destroying mosques and executing prisoners. But Milošević used his right to cross-examine witnesses as an opportunity to present his own version of history, one where Serbs were always victims, where Western powers had conspired to destroy Yugoslavia, and where his actions had been justified responses to external aggression. The proceedings stretched on for years, as Milošević's health began to deteriorate under the stress of representing himself in the most complex war crimes trial in history. By early 2006, the man who had once commanded armies and terrorized nations was a shadow of his former self, confined to a small cell in the Scheveningen detention center and battling multiple health problems that seemed to worsen with each passing month. Milošević suffered from hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease, conditions exacerbated by the stress of his trial and his refusal to take prescribed medications regularly. He rejected most medical advice and insisted on continuing to represent himself despite the physical toll. His most persistent demand was for permission to travel to Russia for specialized cardiac treatment. Russian doctors, he claimed, were the only ones he trusted, and Russian hospitals were the only facilities capable of addressing his complex medical needs. The request was politically explosive. Russia had been Milošević's strongest international supporter throughout the Yugoslav wars, providing diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council and offering sanctuary to other Serbian war criminals. Allowing him to travel to Moscow would essentially mean releasing him into the custody of a government that had opposed his prosecution from the beginning. Tribunal judges rejected the request repeatedly, offering instead to bring Russian doctors to The Hague or to provide any treatment available in Dutch hospitals. But Milošević refused these alternatives. As his trial entered its 4th year, the man who had once seemed larger than life appeared increasingly frail in court. On March 10, 2006, Milošević conducted what would be his final cross-examination of a witness. That evening, he returned to his cell in the UN detention center for what would be his last night alive. If you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories about power, corruption, and the price of accountability. Thanks to all who do. Guards found Slobodan Milošević dead in his bed at 10:20 a.m. on March 11, 2006. There was no suicide note, no signs of violence, no indication of struggle. He appeared to have died peacefully in his sleep. But the autopsy revealed a detail that transformed a natural death into an enduring mystery. The official cause of death was myocardial infarction, a massive heart attack brought on by years of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and the stress of his lengthy trial. Given Milošević's medical history and his refusal to take prescribed medications consistently, the conclusion seemed straightforward. But toxicology tests revealed something shocking: traces of rifampicin, a tuberculosis medication that was not prescribed to Milošević and that he had no medical reason to be taking. Rifampicin is a powerful antibiotic, but it has a dangerous side effect when combined with certain heart medications. It can reduce their effectiveness, potentially triggering fatal cardiac events in patients with existing heart conditions. This discovery ignited a firestorm of speculation about Milosevic's death. Had he somehow obtained the medication himself, in a deliberate attempt to worsen his condition and force the tribunal to grant his request for treatment in Russia? Had someone else provided it to him as part of a more sinister plan? The investigation into his death found no evidence of foul play, but it also couldn't explain how he had accessed a medication that wasn't available in the detention center's pharmacy. Prison officials insisted that their security protocols made it impossible for him to obtain unauthorized drugs, yet the rifampicin in his system was undeniable. Some investigators theorized that Milošević had been secretly taking the medication for months, gradually undermining his own treatment in hopes of convincing judges that his condition was too serious to continue the trial. Others suggested darker possibilities. Milošević possessed detailed knowledge of Serbian intelligence operations, war crimes committed by other officials, and financial networks that had sustained his regime for over a decade. His death conveniently silenced a man who could have implicated dozens of other war criminals and exposed corruption schemes worth billions of dollars. The timing was particularly suspicious to conspiracy theorists. Milošević died just weeks before the tribunal was expected to conclude the prosecution case, meaning he would never face cross-examination by his own defense team or have the opportunity to present his version of events in detail. But perhaps the most disturbing theory was the simplest one, that Milošević had planned his own end as the ultimate act of defiance, choosing to leave this world on his own terms rather than face inevitable conviction and life imprisonment. The investigation ultimately concluded that while the presence of rifampicin was suspicious, there was insufficient evidence to determine whether it had been self-administered or provided by someone else. The tribunal officially classified his death as natural causes, but questions lingered about how one of the world's most closely watched prisoners had obtained unauthorized medication. In the end, the man who set Europe on fire walked into death with no conviction, no closure for victims, and no last words for history. After 4 years of testimony from hundreds of witnesses, evidence of systematic atrocities spanning 3 wars, and one of the most expensive war crimes trial in history, the verdict that millions of victims had waited for would never come. The tribunal was forced to officially close his case without reaching a judgment. Legally, Milošević died presumed innocent, despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The man who had mastered the art of escaping consequences for his actions had achieved his final escape, not through clever legal maneuvering or political manipulation, but through the one avenue that no court could control. Today, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia has convicted dozens of war criminals and established legal precedents that continue to influence international justice. But the absence of a verdict in the Milošević case remains a permanent reminder of the limitations of human justice. Do you think he died naturally, or there was something more nefarious at play? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about power, corruption, and the price of evading justice, be sure to subscribe.